On average, if a customer's complaint is effectively addressed, he or she will tell up to 5 people about their positive experience. But if their complaint is not handled properly, they'll tell more than 9 people about it. As you see, every day your business can rise or fall on your ability to manage dissatisfied customers. For some winning strategies on this, here's Jack Mackey. Jack Mackey is an executive with one of the world's top consumer research companies. His insights on customer service, recovery, and loyalty are based on personal experience and data from over 100 million customer transactions. Listen as Jack Mackey shares strategies for dealing with dissatisfied customers.
Handling dissatisfied customers is definitely not the most enjoyable part of the job. But the good news is you don't have to lose the customer, and you don't have to lose your own cool either. So in today's program, we're going to talk about ways to handle dissatisfied customers in ways that make them want to come back. Now, when I use the expression handle dissatisfied customers, I don't mean in a half-hearted, go through the motions, just kind of process the aggravating situation may. I mean a wholehearted, all-out effort to truly win back that customer's loyalty and goodwill. Now, a good place to start is by being honest with ourselves. Most of the time when a customer complains, they have a very good reason, and it's our fault. We've made service promises that we have not kept. And the customer is right to complain. In fact, we know that very few customers will actually complain to us directly. So when someone steps up and gives you the chance to make things right, it's a real opportunity to win back a customer that might otherwise defect and tell many other people how dissatisfied they are with your service. Many of the problems that we have with customers are actually predictable. As a leader, knowing full well that some of these problems are predictable, it is your responsibility to prepare for them, to not be surprised, and to have effective plans for service recovery. If you take those steps as a manager, then you will be able to prepare your team to effectively deal with dissatisfied customers. Fortunately, it's a pretty straightforward process. It comes down to one major principle. Treat the person, then the problem. Okay, that is definitely worth writing down. Treat the person, then the problem. And the sequence of that is extremely important. Treating the person has to do with trying to diffuse their anger and give them a chance to settle down so that you can solve their problem. But if you try to skip that step and go straight to solving the problem, you can actually make the situation worse. You can kind of create an explosive situation, because by the time a customer has gotten angry enough to step out of their comfort zone and complain to you, they are a little bit emotional themselves, aren't they? So I want to show you a demonstration that I think makes a great example of why it doesn't make sense to try to talk to somebody when they are expressing themselves to you. In fact, the number one thing that you want to do in diffusing customers is by listening without interrupting. Now, I think we've all heard that we should listen without interrupting, but let me give you a very concrete demonstration of how this works and why it's such a good idea. We have here a situation where if this is the customer and this is the negative experience they have, when a customer has a negative experience, they're going to have a little bit of a reaction to it. And as that reaction causes them to get upset, you can see changes in the way that they look and behave, and the really excited ones, they'll start telling you all about it. And they're telling you, and they're telling you, and they're going to keep on telling you. Now, if you try to interrupt them, or if you try to tell them anything, and you try to pour anything in here, what's going to happen? You're not going to be successful. How about this approach? What if you tried to stop this by putting your thumb over it? What would happen then? Even worse, right? So this is a great mental image to have in your mind when the next time you find yourself confronted by a customer and they have a lot to say about this bad experience that they just had. The number one best thing you can do is sincerely and genuinely listen without interrupting. Fortunately, that applies to all angry people that you face, including your children, your spouse. So this is a very usable technique. The most effective thing you can do is to be quiet. Now, the second thing, immediately after the customer pauses and they're finally giving you the look like, so what are you going to do about it? The first words out of your mouth are, I apologize for the service breakdown. Now that phrase, there's been a lot of thought given to that phrase. There's magic in these words, I apologize for the service breakdown. And let me just walk through why it's so effective. When that customer complains to you, do they think they deserve an apology? Absolutely. So when you say the words, I apologize, first words out of your mouth, okay, there's something they wanted, received. Then you say, I apologize for the service breakdown. So what does that mean? You're acknowledging that the customer has a legitimate complaint of some kind, even though we haven't gotten into it yet. When you say, I apologize for the service breakdown, what does that convey? What does that suggest? That this is not normally how we do business. This is an unusual failure of our process, which gives the customer some assurance. And then when you say, I apologize for the service breakdown, you don't have to blame anybody. You don't have to blame the customer. You don't have to blame any of your coworkers or another department. It is the best phrasing that I have been able to come up with in years of looking at this problem. So modify it for yourself if you want to say I'm sorry instead of I apologize, but use the expression for the service breakdown, and that will set the stage for a much better problem resolution. Another important element here of this process of treating the person is to reflect back to them on the specific problem they just complained about. So in other words, it's fine to say it's a service breakdown, but at some point you've got to say, Miss Customer, I know you went to great lengths to make sure we got this order right, and we delivered it incorrectly. It was an utter failure. Specific, reflecting back, it was a big deal. The content of what happened as well as the content of the customer's feelings. So you see how that can work? So you don't want to be condescending, and you don't have to paraphrase it, word for word what they say, but just something that says, hey, it can be as simple as this. You shouldn't have to put up with this. This is terrible. I don't blame you. Just even something that straightforward. So that's reflecting. So now by this time, you've got a person who was really upset, and they're like in this state now. They're a little bit calmer now. At least someone cares. They've gone from thinking this is the worst organization, it's totally incompetent, to, well, at least there's one good person here who understands my problem. So now you're in a much better place. Other things that you can do is when customers are complaining and they give you a litany of all the things that are wrong, sometimes one of the best things you can say is, you're right about that. Don't argue or defend or anything, but just say, Mr. Customer, you're right about that. And that, instead of the arguments and defensiveness they were expecting, again, causes them to just say, well, they can't help but believe you're on their side. Because what have you said? You've listened without interrupting. You apologized for the service breakdown. You reflected back that you understood they were upset about the order that they tried so hard to get right being wrong. They shouldn't have to put up with this. They're right. Well, what's there left to fight about? So now you've taken all the fight out of the person. Now, that's not the whole solution, but that is definitely the first step. And eventually, of course, they're going to say or think, what are you going to do about my problem? So we're going to get to that in just a minute by taking some of your collective management and real life experience. So here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about the worst and best examples of customer service recovery that you have ever seen or been a part of. So this could have been a time when you had a customer and you did a great job of turning them around, or you had a customer and it was a disaster, or you were the customer and the company that you interacted with did a great job turning you around, or it was a disaster. So I want you to try to write down a couple of each of these, and we're going to draw a line down the middle of your paper. Across the top, draw a T. On the left-hand side, I want you to write kudos. On the right-hand side, I want you to write catastrophes. So you're going to make a list of service recovery events that are going to be going in the kudos column. These are good examples we ought to congratulate. And the catastrophe column. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about this. But remember, it can be a problem you were involved in as the customer, or a problem you were involved in as the representative of your company in this job or past job? Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes. See if you can get 3 of each. Kudos and catastrophes. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I've always noticed people love to talk about the problems that other people have had. This is always the most interactive exercise. But they did it so that you could have in mind the types of problems that are typical, and you also gain some confidence that, yes, there are a lot of success stories, and unfortunately there are some catastrophes too. What I want to deal with now, we have already talked about how to diffuse a situation where you weren't expecting the problem, and now we're going to talk about a more predictable problem. So in thinking about the problems that you just listened to within your organization, you earlier wrote down 3 common complaints, and now you thought about a couple of others. So you've probably identified some patterns. So certain things are fairly predictable and have the same problems over and over again. So again, as a responsible manager, thinking about plans for these, you look out and you see who does a good job with this, dealing with predictable problems. And one of the organizations or industries that I'm familiar with is the airline industry. Because of my travel, the airline industry has chosen to create a predictable problem for themselves. Let me tell you what it is. On very popular routes, the airlines have more demand than they have seats. And unfortunately, customers sometimes who paid for the seats don't show up. They don't show up because their plans changed at the last minute or because the airline's incoming flight wasn't on time. So then this very popular flight will fly out with empty seats, which costs revenue for the airline. So in response to that situation, the airlines deliberately overbook some flights. Would it surprise you to know that? But they do this because so often it works out in their favor that people do not show up and do cancel, and so they do get revenue benefits from that. But they also sometimes have that unhappy situation where every customer shows up and they have to tell a couple of them that they can't fly, even though every one of those customers bought and paid for a ticket. So how do airlines handle this predictable problem? Well, they all handle it a little bit differently, but one airline that I admire, they pay people not to get on the airline. And they start this very early in the waiting process. Like the minute they become aware that, oops, we're in trouble, they start making announcements. Hey, folks, good news. We are in an oversold situation. Some lucky person is going to get a free round-trip ticket to any place they like and an upgrade on the next flight out. If you would like to volunteer, please step up. Well, this is a whole lot better of an approach than hoping to the very end that somebody won't show up or they'll be okay with getting off the plane. So that approach has been adopted by almost all the airlines. And obviously there's cost to that. But those costs overall have made sense for the airlines. So again, with predictable problems, the resolution may have some cost. But if we truly believe in the value of a customer, the value of a loyal customer, the lifetime value of repeated purchases, and the value of our good reputation, we definitely owe it to ourselves as managers to develop solutions for predictable problems. Would you agree? So now I believe that since you as a manager will not be there for every single one of these problems, the logical next requirement is we've got to teach our employees how to do this because we won't be around to make up such an elegant solution as this. We have to think about it ahead of time, then we need to train people. So I have some thoughts on that I'd like to share with you. First of all, let's be honest and say you can't train people for every situation. So for the predictable ones, do have a plan, a fire drill that everybody knows, it's pre-approved. That solves a certain set of problems. The other set of problems, though, that can't be predicted, the only way that organizations that are great at service handle those is they empower the employees to do whatever it takes to solve the problem. And I know that sounds like a pretty big statement, but I'll say it again. Really stellar service organizations empower their employees to do whatever it takes to solve the problem. There's a couple of good examples. One of them I'm very familiar with is there's a department store chain. It happens to be one of my favorites. And it's not a real big company, but it's very famous. Every year they always honor it as having the best customer service. And they're also famous, they've been written up in a lot of business journals, they're also famous for their employee manual. When it comes to dealing with unpredictable situations and customer complaints, they have one sentence: use your own best judgment at all times. That's an example of empowerment, right? There's one example that goes beyond that, because if you say to employees, do whatever it takes, use your own best judgment, that's one thing. This next company literally gives employees a budget in advance to solve customer problems. This is an international luxury hotel chain where losing a customer could be worth $100,000 over the life of that customer. They do not want to lose one customer. So they will give the employees in this particular international hotel company a pre-approved budget. Just do it. Solve the problem. Don't aggravate the customer by saying, well, wait a minute, I have to go ask for permission to do the right thing for you. Instead, just do whatever it takes to solve the customer's problem. So that is a great solution as far as it goes. There is always the possibility, though, that an employee or you might not actually know how to solve the customer's problem. It might not be obvious. These are difficult situations, and you just don't know the answers to all these questions. So a good solution to that is to ask the customer. Say, look, I want to do whatever it takes to make this right. What do you think is a fair solution? Or, other language, how is this different from what you were expecting? I could see this is not what you expected. How is it different? What would you like me to do about this? So ask the customer, and then remember that rule, do whatever it takes to satisfy the customer. So now, sometimes in these conversations, managers will say to me, but wait a minute, sometimes customers will try to take advantage of us. They might complain when there isn't really a problem, just trying to take advantage of our desire to maintain a good reputation. Well, it's true, it's difficult to know when a customer is playing you, but this is the approach I take. Most of the time, 97, 98% of the time, complaints are valid. And to let the 2% of the time that they're not be the tail that wags the dog is not the right approach if your desire is to be an excellent service organization. So it's okay. Consider it a cost of doing business. It's a cost of service recovery that occasionally there'll be a customer who takes advantage of you. But then there are other customers, they're not trying to take advantage of you. And remember, the customer is never wrong, so I'll put it this way. Sometimes they're just mistaken about the facts. So when you have a customer that is mistaken about the facts, that is, there's an interesting challenge there. And since it's happened to so many people, there's a good solution. I actually observed this solution in one of these big do-it-yourself stores. A customer came in and had asked the clerk who was helping customers, said, I need a space heater. My bathroom isn't warm enough, and it's freezing in there, and I need a space heater. And the helpful representative said, well, how large is the room? And the customer said, it's about 8 by 8. So the representative went over to the merchandise and picked up this box and said, this would be just perfect for your problem. The little bitty size of that, the customer's perception was, that is way too small. Now that salesman, that customer representative knew that was the right size. He knew the customer was wrong, but he didn't say, oh no, you're wrong. Instead, you know what he said when she said, oh no, that's way too small? He said, well, you might be right about that. Let's have a look. Now that's different from when you say to the customer, you're right. You might be right about that. Let's have a look. Now he hands the box to her, and she looks down it, and sure enough, she reads the heat output and the BTU ratings and the size of room it's scoped for, and she says, wow, this really must be a powerful little unit. He said, I've had nothing but satisfied customers. So when customers are mistaken about the facts, I like the expression, even if I know they're wrong, you might be right, let's have a look. And then investigate the facts with the customer. That's a great way to save face for everybody. A key principle to keep in mind is you should never argue with a customer. So even if there are differences, there are alternatives to arguing with customers. And this example we just had a minute ago, you might be right about that. Let's have a look. That's called diplomatic disagreement, where you're not disagreeing directly, You're not saying you're wrong or I know better or do anything to embarrass or disparage the customer. But you're being very effective in getting them to come to the same conclusion, which is that this will solve their problem, for example. So can you see how that makes sense? It's easy to use. It's easy to teach. Very easy to teach your employees. Another situation is for those customers that they're unhappy with something, but there's no way you can change what they're unhappy about. Like the price of something. This happens all the time. They think it's too high. In the same hardware store, I overheard a customer complaining to an employee. He was holding a crescent wrench and he said, "This crescent wrench is a ripoff. No one pays $18 for a crescent wrench. One lousy crescent wrench." And the employee was really poised and just said, "I'm sorry, sir. Where did you get the idea that $18 was too much for a crescent wrench of that brand?" And the customer was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And the employee says, "Well, this comes with a lifetime warranty. It's rust-proof, and they claim it's break-proof, so if it ever breaks or rusts, you can bring it back for your money back." So we have a lot of other less expensive crescent wrenches, but that's the story behind this one. Oh, customer did not know that. They got some education. It's not trying to bully the customer into buying something they don't want to, but it's just having a reasonable conversation. Another easy approach that's well known is what's called the feel, felt, found technique. You may have heard it before, but it's good to be reminded from time to time because it's so effective. I had a friend who was in the business of cleaning people's swimming pools. And so every time a new person would move into a house with a swimming pool, she sells them her service. And she goes through the whole process of telling them how the service is going to make their life a lot easier. And at the end of the sales pitch, the customer invariably asks, "How much is it?" And she always starts with the annual plan, which is $450. So she says it's $450 for the year. And if a customer has never owned a home with a pool before, they are horrified. They go, "What? That's way too much money. I know I can get it for less." And she has a great response. She says, "Mr. New Homeowner, I know how you feel about that $450. That's a big number." A lot of customers that are with me now felt just like you. Until they found out when they checked with all the other pool cleaning companies, they all are going to charge you $50 a month. So your best deal is the annual $450 plan. She was very successful and is still cleaning pools. Let's summarize what we've learned today. Problems and service breakdowns are predictable. Therefore, have a service recovery plan for those recurring problems. Second, remember the principle in dealing with customers that are dissatisfied. Treat the person, then the problem. And third, use the alternatives we talked about to arguing with customers. If you will implement these strategies that we have discussed today in your organization, you and your team will be well positioned to recover from customer service breakdowns and prepared to deal with complaint resolution.